Hi all, this is just some quick information about budgets, timelines, and reporting. So things that are specific to grants that aren't covered in our textbook materials. Particularly budgets and timelines are going to be of interest to you as they're part of your proposal project, but I'll give you more information specifically about your own proposals as we work through those. So talk about budgets, timelines, and reporting today. So your grant budget is not your organizational budget, right? So you don't want to confuse kind of like what your institution or even what your classroom budget might look like with what you're proposing for your grant budget. The purpose of the grant budget is to detail the costs of the program or project you're proposing, to show the funder exactly what their money will pay for, and to list other sources of income for costs not covered by the grant being requested. In other words, you're requesting money, so what's that money going to be used for if you're granted that money? A grant timeline, often presented as a Gantt chart, which we'll talk about in a minute, tells the grant reader when major project milestones will begin and end during the grant's funding period, which is usually a 12-month period, but there are, of course, multi-year grants. And there is not a timeline specified for the grant proposal. So you can think about it, a 12-month period is pretty good. The timeline also includes information about who is accountable for each activity and how you will evaluate the program's accomplishments during that period. And a grant report is something you do after you've been funded and after you've completed your study, or perhaps while you're completing your study, completing your work. And this is a formal way for you to update your funders on what you have accomplished with their grant money. Many funders have some grant reporting guidelines, but some funders have no guidelines at all. While the latter may seem like a dream come true, it can be hard to write a grant report with no guidelines. So reporting may involve progress reports, audits, and summative reports that conclude a funded project. Right? In other words, you have to basically say, this is what I said I was going to do with the money, and this is what we did with the money. And that makes sense, right? That if you're funded, that you provide some kind of report on what you did with that funding. So let's talk about writing a budget for a proposal. So the budget should be developed concurrently with your research plan, right? So as you develop your research plan, what you plan to do, everything in the budget must be justified then by the proposed work and research activities. The proposed budget should be reasonable and align with the funding agency's instructions, right? So they should match up with whatever your funding agency says. And of course that will differ widely, right? Although it's unlikely a proposal would be rejected solely on the basis of a poorly written budget, funding agencies will not fund unreasonable costs, and so it will not. It's not unusual to win a grant but receive less than full funding. A project that is well planned and or justified reduces this possibility. Grant authors can always check budget questions they might have with the grant program officer before submitting their proposal, especially given that the criteria guidelines for budget allocations and grant calls are often ambiguous, right? And that's certainly the case in the request for proposals that I've modified for this class. So when you think about your budget, what you want to think about is what resources will you need to pay for in order to make your research happen. So I know some of you might be working with technology, right? What technology do you need to purchase? So you might be working with other people, and should those people receive a stipend or some kind of compensation for the work that you're asking them to do? Would you yourself need to offset some of your income in order to be able to do this work as part of your larger work, right? So in university settings, we often have to buy out some of our teaching time to make time for us to complete the work we propose for a grant, and that's part of something you might put in your budget. There are two parts of your budget. There's the grant budget, which you can think of as a budget worksheet. That's often a table. And there's a budget narrative. The budget narrative is where you kind of justify why you're spending that money on that thing, right? So items to be billed to the grant and the methods used to determine those costs are listed in the budget detail worksheet, while brief descriptions supporting these costs are considered in the budget narrative, right? So in other words, you say, this is what I'm spending my money on, this is how much money, this is what it's for. That's kind of like your table, right? Your budget detail worksheet. And then your narrative says, well, why is this person necessary? Why is this payment necessary? Why is that piece of material necessary? And it's very brief, right? It can just be kind of a per item thing an explanation as to why you need those things. And we're going to look at the different budget detail worksheet and narrative categories that can be included. So here's a budget outline. Here's kind of the general needs that we typically talk about when we talk about project budgets. Now, of course, you may not have all of these parts to your budget because not all of these things may be relevant to what your proposal plans to do. The biggest: personnel, fringe benefits, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, construction, other, and indirect costs. So personal through other are all considered direct costs. Those are costs it takes directly to run the study. And indirect costs we'll talk about are funds that don't go directly to the people running the study, but go to the institution or agency that's hosting you while you're doing that study. Personnel is the most obvious, right? Personnel needed to complete the project activities. These usually include project directors, staff assistants, release time, or stipends for faculty. In other words, who's involved, who needs to be compensated in some way. So list each position by title and name of employee if available. Show the annual salary rate and the percentage of time to be devoted to the project. Compensation paid for employees engaged in grant activities must be consistent with that paid for similar work within the applicant organization, right? So if you're a teacher and you make, I don't know, what depends what area you're in and where you're teaching, right? Well, let's just say you make $35,000 a year, and you are going to spend a quarter of your time working on a grant work instead of teaching, right? Then you would be supplemented your 3/4 teaching load with 1/4 grant funding, and so you would figure out that based on your annual salary rate. In the budget narrative, include a description of the responsibilities and duties of each position in relationship to fulfilling the project goals and objectives, right? So in other words, why does this person need to be paid? Because they're going to be doing these certain activities that are central to making sure your study can happen. All requested information must be included in the budget detail worksheet and budget narrative. Fringe benefits. Fringe benefits are something you'll typically figure out with your grant agency who's connected to where you work, right? A lot of grants, a lot of organizations have grant and sponsored programs offices to help you figure out things like fringe benefits. But fringe benefits are really all those employee benefits that are mandated by the state or federal government. It has to be required to employees, right? So if you have health insurance or retirement requirements because of where you work, those are not part of your salary but are fringe benefits, and those can be funded in part by the grant if your part of your work is happening through the grant, part of what becomes your actual work. This may not be significant for the kind of proposal you're doing now, but it would be definitely significant if you had a big grant that was going to take a lot of time to administer. Travel is another important area. So travel needed to complete the project. You can itemize travel expenses of staff personnel, right? So if staff have to travel for training, to do interviews, to have group meetings, whatever, right? So any kind of travel that would be mandated, you would list that here. You would have to describe the purpose of each travel expenditure in reference to the project objectives. Show the basis of computation. For example, 6 people at a 3-day training at whatever the cost is, right? In training programs or projects, travel and meals for trainees should be listed separately. Show the number of trainees and the unit costs involved. Identify the location of travel if known or if unknown. Indicate location to be determined. Indicate whether applicants' formal written travel policy or the federal travel regulations are followed. So if you are applying for a grant through your agency, for example, me through Northwestern State University, I would have to follow all state travel policies in my requests as I build my budget. Once again, depending on what your proposal is, you may not have to deal with travel, but it's a common expense that we find in budgets. Equipment. Equipment is for unit costs over $5,000 that are non-expendable items. So in other words, it's a big item you need to purchase for your grant that you will keep following the end of the grant. Consider, for example, if you were doing some kind of scientific analysis of something and you needed to purchase a mass spectrometer. Well, that mass spectrometer might cost $100,000. And that mass spectrometer, of course, allows you to analyze, if you watch any of these crime shows, analyze the contents of chemicals. But that's a huge expense, right? So that would be listed separately as an item, and once again, you would have to list it and then justify that expense. This is not to be confused with expendable items, or things that you'll use up in the course of your study, which would go in our next category, which is supplies. So applicants should analyze the cost benefits of purchasing versus leasing equipment. So a lot of times, say I need a particular piece of equipment, I would have to be able to justify a really big expense on one piece of equipment if it's available for leasing instead of purchase, right? So that way I could reduce the cost of the grant by leasing the equipment for the period of the grant, rather than buying a big piece of equipment that I would then get to keep, right? The grant would have paid. Especially because a lot of like technologies rapidly advance, and that piece of equipment may not be even useful for a long amount of time. But if you do decide to have rented or leased equipment rather than purchased equipment, you would include that in the contractual category, which we'll talk about in a minute. But in the budget narrative, explain how the equipment is necessary for the success of the project and describe the procurement method to be used. All requested information must be included in the budget detail worksheet and the budget narrative, right? So what is it? What's it going to be used for? And then in your narrative, kind of why does it matter? Why is it important? Supplies then, of course, as I just mentioned, are the materials and supplies needed to support the completion of a project's objectives. Equipment items less than $5,000 may be listed in this category, right? So those are things that you might keep, right? Like a computer that would outlast, but they're not really big expenses. And list items by type. So office supplies, postage, training materials, copy paper, expendable equipment items costing less than $5,000, like books, handheld tape recorders, different kind of materials you would need to complete the project that you proposed. And show the basis for computation. In other words, right, line up how all these things add up. I'm going to have 4 people doing interviews. Well, I need 4 handheld tape recorders, for example, right? Generally, supplies include any materials that are expendable or consumed during the project. All requested information must be included in the budget detail worksheet and the budget narrative. So remember, you're going to see in your budget everything. First, it's going to be in a chart where it kind of outlines, here's my costs, and then it's in a narrative that explains what we're going to use it for and why it's important and why it's worth investing money. Contractual is basically anything you're going to hire somebody who's outside of your research team to do for you. So, for example, part of your research may talk about bringing in speakers to talk about inequity in whatever particular area you were talking about. So let's talk about inequity tied to race and ethnicity, and your proposal is to begin a speaker series where different speakers would come in monthly to educate high school teachers who work with vulnerable populations. And so each of those speakers is not actually part of the grant, but is a contractor or a consultant, somebody who works outside of the grant, and that you're then giving a sub-award basically to, right? You're paying them to do part of your work, but they're not actual personnel for the work. So anything that you're going to give to external project partners. There are different ways to think about this. You can think about them as sub-awards. That is, if you have a grant program within your grant. So right now I'm part of a grant that's a really large grant. And part of what we do is give smaller grants from that large grant to other agencies so that they can use that money to do their own work. Those are sub-awards. Procurement contracts are basically like if you have to get things through a particular agency, because perhaps you're a state agency and there's state purchasing rules. Those are procurement contracts, and you sometimes have to pay fees associated with that, and you need to specify what those fees are so that they can be part of your grant request as part of your budget. And consultant fees are kind of those people you're going to hire who are outside, right, to come in and consult and be part of your grant, do part of that work there. This includes some kind of federal information. I think it's just helpful for you to know kind of the complexity of grants and budgets, even if you're not going to do it for this class, because you may do it in the future. And certainly when you work for an agency, a university or community college or even a school district, there are people who can help you develop these parts of your grant. Construction is something that's not typically covered, but it is possible that you may need to have building modifications or costs related to building something or repairing something or changing something. So for example, imagine you write a grant in which you want to redesign a classroom to test whether the design of the classroom impacts learning in that classroom or some aspect or some outcome in that classroom, right? You may be familiar, there are different approaches to classroom design, right? Some classrooms are closed, single settings with rows of tables or rows of individual chairs. Some are more open designs where you have tables with multiple students sitting around them. They're not all facing where the teacher might be when they're teaching. There are other places that are even more open where different classrooms are connected to allow for different kinds of movement around those spaces. Perhaps you want to make a classroom where you could pull out dividers to make smaller classrooms during that time, right? These are construction costs that might be tied to your proposal. Other is kind of where you throw everything else in there. So maybe you want to hire an external evaluator to come and help you evaluate the success of your program. Maybe you need to pay for marketing costs, right? Have advertising to get people to participate. There might be things like printing needs, any other kind of other costs. Some of the kind of more common ones, though, might be like rent. If you had to rent a space to run your project out of, some agencies and institutions charge rent for research spaces, and that's basically because they want to keep the people who are getting funded to have a space to work, and people who are not getting funded to not take up space that somebody could actually use, right? Reproduction might be the use of other people's materials, and you have to pay them a fee for that. Maybe you need a dedicated telephone line. Maybe you need some cell phones to go with people when they go out to do field work. Maybe you're hosting events, so you need janitorial or security services. And then other kinds of funds that you might need. So once again, you would basically need to explain these in your budget and outline them in your budget, and then explain them and why they're necessary in your budget narrative. Indirect costs are something that happens when you're hosted by an institution that has guidelines about their costs involved in supporting research on their host site. Universities almost always have policies for indirect costs. Community colleges and school districts depend on how big they are and how much research tends to happen on those campuses. So that, but basically this is a percentage of the grant award that is automatically given straight to the institution or agency that's hosting the research to kind of offset any costs that they might have associated with hosting that research. Right? Anything like, you can imagine electricity for a building, right? They can't parcel that out to each individual room. So what they do is they basically say we have a lot of indirect costs not directly associated with this project. It's a way that institutions make money off of grants, and one reason why big institutions tend to expect their faculty and staff to pursue grants, right? It's a way to fund the university through research. So here's a quick kind of sample grant proposal budget worksheet. You'll notice it has budget items. It has it broken down by categories. In this case, personnel, direct expenses, travel. And right, you don't have to cover the one, include the ones you're not going to use, right? This is the ones that this particular grant was going to use, right? And then it has a kind of a what it is and basically how much it costs, and then has a total category, right? It doesn't have to be really complicated. It should be really straightforward and clear. Basically say these are the costs and this is what we expect to spend if we're granted this money. This is where the money is going to go. So a project timeline and deliverables is a similar kind of consideration. And a lot of times you'll see timelines and budgets tied together. That is, certain costs associated with different deliverables, different things that that we might expect to achieve, right? And so the grant proposal should provide reviewers with an easy-to-read project timeline, right? It could have kind of how are you going to break down the process of what you'll actually do if you're given this money. Well, do I need to develop some kind of resources? Do I need to identify and recruit participants? Do I need to reproduce materials or distribute materials? Do I need to conduct interviews or distribute surveys and collect data? When am I going to analyze that data? And when is the report going to be ready, right? And this is kind of, if you think about like all the different pieces, how they're going to end up if you were actually to run your study, what are the things you'd have to do? Well, each of those things should be part of a big timeline that basically says by the end of the grant period, let's imagine 1 year, we will have achieved and completed what we've proposed to do, piece by piece. So a graphic or a table highlighting the timeline can provide a quick summary of the planned project sequence. The grant timeline should include a list of milestones, right, what we hope to accomplish, or deliverables, what we hope to produce, and be realistic. Grant authors should not propose more work than can be reasonably done during the proposed project period, and allow time for unanticipated delays, such as problems with participant recruiting. One of the things that people don't often think about is that sometimes people don't want to participate in research, and so finding and recruiting participants can be a challenge, especially if your research involves a lot of time and no compensation. In the cases where research ethics approval is required, and we'll talk about that towards the end of this session, approvals can take anywhere from a few days to many months, right? Because you have to, there are institutional review boards that have to clear your research. Depending on the institution, and multi-site studies typically demand even more time. The timeline and list of deliverables can also include plans for dissemination, right? What you're going to do with that work once it's done, like a conference presentation, technical report, journal publication, whatever you would do with this study results when you're done with them. And when appropriate, grant authors may consider dissemination plans that include distribution to non-academic audiences, such as policymakers and or practitioners locally, nationally, and internationally. So if you run a study and you find that doing this particular activity improves or reduces differences in outcomes for youth, then perhaps your final step is to share that with other teachers in your particular area, right? That's a way to kind of think about dissemination. That is getting out what you've learned from your study to other audiences, whether they're academic or non-academic. Here's some elements of the grant timeline, things you want to think about. So when you develop a project timeline, keep in mind the grant reader wants to see answers to the following questions. What are the key tasks or activities that will be carried out to implement the program successfully? Did the grant applicant include all tasks from the day funding is announced or awarded to the last day of the project's funding time frame? Can each task realistically begin and end in the proposed time frame? Are evaluation activities included in the timeline chart? Who is responsible for seeing that each activity is implemented and completed? So when you're setting your schedule, because you never know how many disruptions and malfunctions you'll encounter in implementing a grant program, funded program, you can set up your activity start and stop dates in quarterly increments, right? That's breaking up the year into 4 pieces, right? If you have total control and you want to be more specific, you could break it down by monthly increments to show kind of when they begin and end. So the main point of this is you just want to set a schedule that the person who's reading your grant application can understand what are the milestones you expect to complete and when will you begin and end them, right? How much time will you spend on each task? So here's kind of a sample timeline. You'll notice there are, it's quarterly, and on the left-hand side, this is a table, right? So on the left-hand side, it says what they hope to achieve. Then it says in which quarter that's going to happen, so which 3-month period of the year that's going to happen. And on the right-hand side, you'll notice it says who is responsible for making sure that happens, right? And so that's an important thing to consider, right? Who is going to do the things that are going to happen in the grant? Are these things that are going to happen? Are you responsible for all of them as the activity coordinator, or are other people involved in the grant responsible for other things, right? One way that people commonly present times that are going to activities are going to happen over time with different starting and end dates, right? When you think about our project as one giant start to end date, and within that, all our little tasks might overlap because we need to complete them, right? We need to do interviews over a longer period of time, so we have time to sit down with everybody, and that might overlap then with the writing of our paper, right, or the analysis of our data. Because once we have enough interviews collected, we can start creating a code book to analyze our data, all these things. But it's the same idea as our previous slide, except you're actually showing that time. So instead of just saying during this quarter this will be completed, you're going to say, right, from week 15 to 18 we'll work on this, right? And we could have multiple activities kind of overlapping with other activities if necessary. So what are the various activities that are going to happen? When does each activity begin and end? How long does each activity scheduled to last? And then where activities overlap with other activities and by how much? And then, of course, the start and end date of the whole project. So as you're thinking about now making your proposal something you might really do, what are the tasks that are involved in actually getting it done? And how long might they take to get done? And just really quickly, if you do have to, if you are granted a grant in the future at some time, you'll have to write a grant report. Like I said in the beginning, sometimes they're progress reports, what you've done up to that point in your grant funding cycle. Sometimes they're economic audits, which are basically is the money going to where you said it was going to go, and there's usually some kinds of progress reports as well. And of course, at the end of every grant cycle, you will have some report on what the grant accomplished and kind of where all the money went and what are the results of that grant. Because it's the people who fund grants and the organizations who fund grants want to know that the money they've invested in your project has actually been used for what you said it was going to be used for, and that it's had some kind of impact. And so, usually there are guidelines that kind of say these are the sections you need to talk about. Generally speaking, though, these are the sections. So, a heartfelt thank you. Of course, you want to always say be appreciative of the funding you get. What were the actual grant activities you proposed to do, and when and how did you do them? Outcomes and impact, basically then say why did it matter, right? So what difference did your project make? If you had any changes to the initial grant proposal, you'd want to make sure you document those so that people know that there were changes. This can happen sometimes. If there are big changes, significant changes, we're going to shift a lot of money around, you need to make sure you get approval for those before you actually do them from the funding agency, because some funding agencies are more flexible and some are not. But in any case, you would want to note the things that change, because projects rarely go exactly as planned, and that's okay. Challenges and lessons learned is a chance for you to kind of explain what challenges were not anticipated and how you address those challenges. And lessons learned can signal kind of how that work is going to lead to more work and better work because you've learned it from your experiences. And then future plans and sustainability comes out of that. So how did this particular grant lead to improvements and to future plans in your research and at your institution, and lead to actual changes, sustainable change that's going to impact the organization or system that you were proposing to work on, right? So kind of what's left over. Now the best kind of sustainability is when one grant leads directly to another grant, right? So if you have a grant for doing a small study and then that allows you to get a grant for a big study, people who give those initial grants feel like they've really done good work when your work has proven to be useful enough to be further funded. So once again, questions as always, let me know. I'm here to help.